It's the season of rains here in India, the monsoon as we call it. And this is what we are doing this week. We are discussing the books on monsoon. And the book that I have today with me, and in fact, the book that I am going to discuss for the next few days, is called Monsoon Feelings. And I think it's a really interesting book because when we do talk about the season of rains, the monsoon in India, it's not just about the spectacle of nature. It's not just a environmental phenomenon. It's much more than that. It's obviously um, impossible to imagine that, you know, anyone in India who sees these massive clouds pouring rains and colorful transformations of flora and fauna, they won't get affected or moved by this phenomena. So individuals or collective societies, cultures, they have got impacted by this phenomenon. And that has shaped the history, the culture of the region. And this book captures those feelings in the last millennium. So it covers quite a long history and focuses on the works of art, literature, music, even films to some extent, and then tells us about how monsoon was felt in the Indian subcontinent through this period in the last one millennium. And in fact, some parts of it go beyond that. That is, very briefly talks about Kalidasa's Meghdutta, which we discussed in the previous episode, and how that talks about the monsoon season. So clearly, there's a huge scope in this book where we go from the South Asian paintings to the music, poetry, literature, movies, all of that, but with the season of rains, the monsoon in the background. So, on one hand, we can enhance this feeling of the season of rains, we can enjoy while we are reading this book, but at the same time, I think it's a nice window to understand the culture, the history, the art, the literature of this region through this book. So although it gives you like a glimpse of different arts, um, just that glimpse through that lens of rains or monsoon, but I think that is enough for you to understand or make sense of those different forms of art. And in some ways, we find out how, despite there are so many cultures in the Indian subcontinent, so many religions, so many beliefs, and obviously the diversity, whether it's the linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, all kinds of diversities are there. But then you do see certain unifying factors in all those differences. And art clearly plays an important role in understanding that unity. And when we talk about art, we can also focus on how the monsoon has been discussed or described in various forms of art in different parts of India or the Indian subcontinent. So that clearly tells us that monsoon has been a unifying factor in the subcontinent. So even though that's a natural phenomenon, it somehow shaped the cultural aspects of the Indian subcontinent. It has brought that sense of unity in it. So, for example, when somebody who's living in a poet or an artist who's living in the south of India, that person is witnessing the same clouds traveling from south to north, rains pouring after months of heat. So that person imagines rain or kind of romanticizes it through images, through their art. And the person sitting on the north, let's say in the history, that person could have been in today's Pakistan, somebody from Persian background. That poet or person or artist is also experiencing similar phenomenon. So you find that sense of unity. So, like Kalidasa, who was describing this or romanticizing this idea of rains in the center of India, you can find that in the north of India or towards Pakistan, the Persian poets of the time, they were also doing the same thing. They were also romanticizing. Obviously, they came centuries after Kalidasa, but you can see them doing pretty much similar things. That is, romanticizing rains, using metaphors to describe clouds, rains, their impact on people. So, huge scope, as I keep saying, when it comes to this book. And we get to learn about so many different things. Because obviously, the monsoon is in the background, the rains are in the background, but their manifestations are going to be really different. For example, take this example of Khushwant Singh's novel Train to Pakistan, which is really about the riots and the massacre that took place during the time of India Pakistan partition. So, there also you find in the background the rains are going on. It's pretty much around the season of monsoon. So, that image of monsoon is very bleak. Compare that to with something like a movie called Lagan, where um, those of you who would have watched the movie would remember there's a scene when the rains come and everybody in the village starts dancing and singing and they rejoice it because it's brought so much joy and happiness for them as it has done throughout history for lots of Indians. So, um, different emotions, different feelings, depending on where in history and which people were experiencing this phenomenon. And that's really what we study and explore in this book, the book called Monsoon Feelings. So, on one hand, it talks about how monsoon feels today, where people get inspired by movies, the way it has been romanticized in the Bollywood movies, couples walking in the rains, them doing the romance. But at the same time, it talks about how did the monsoon feel in the past when we didn't have movies, when um, people were very much dependent on agriculture. So the most important aspect of the monsoon was agriculture, and that's how they saw it. They saw the practical value in it. But at the same time, of course, people who were pursuing art, those who were in the royal courts, they still romanticized the rains. They still uh, wrote poetry, wrote songs on the monsoon, on the season, on the rains. So clearly, different people, different societies, they experienced and had different emotions of rains throughout history. And that's something uh, we explore in this book. And the first chapter, there are a number of chapters, each written by a different author. And the first chapter, it talks about the Persian poetry and how that brought or discussed the rains or the monsoon season in India. And as I said, these chapters, these small descriptions, they are going to be your window to understand a completely new art form in each chapter. So the first chapter that I'm going to discuss today, it's about Persian poetry, and although we are just very briefly going to talk about um, the rains and the way Persian poets at that time described rains in India, you'll get some exposure to the Persian poetry of the time, uh, which was quite an important part of the art of the royal courts. Remember, at that time, uh, lot of rulers in India were of the Persian origins, or they have had Persian connections. In some cases, the official language of the court was Persian, and there were certain centuries where India produced more Persian literature than Persia or the Iran itself. So clearly, that had a lot of influence on India, on its culture, on its languages, particularly Hindi and Urdu, as the way we speak it. A lot of words were imported from Persia, from the Persian language, and that really gave way to the Urdu poetry that we know it today. But it comes from the Persian poetry that we had at the time, and a lot of royal uh, courts poets, they were practicing it. And the first and probably the most important name that comes to mind is Masood Saad Salman. I know there's another one and probably more famous one. He's called Amir Khusro, who most of you would have heard of. But I think Masood Saad is probably more important because he came or he lived 2 centuries before Amir Khusro, and he really brought Persian poetry to India and captured the Indian phenomenon, captured the Indian life in Persian. So let me start with reading this small verse from his poem, which goes: Monsoon, spring of India, savior from the torment of summer, you brought tidings of the month of Tir. Once again we escaped the heat. Interestingly, something that you should know, that the monsoon term itself, it comes from the Arabic language. It comes from the word mosam, which we today use for weather, and a lot of Arab people, especially the sailors, the traders, when they were traveling to India, they faced these monsoon winds. So they used that term mosam for monsoon winds. And gradually, after British colonization, when English was more commonly used, the monsoon word became more prominent to describe it. So clearly, you can see that languages have evolved over time, and all these Western influences of Arabic languages, then Persian language, they have had their impact here. So coming back to Masood Saad Salman and Persian poetry, there were three kinds of poems they were writing at that time. One was Masnavi, the other was Qasida, and the third was Ghazal. Ghazal, most of you would be familiar. It's pretty common these days. Even a lot of you would have heard these ghazals in movies or in different forms of music that you enjoy. Masnavi is much more narrative style or topical kind of poetry, where there are different kinds of metaphors. They were employed from the martial life, from the courtly life, so you could get some sense of where that is coming from. It is coming from that royal background, but it was talking about the adventures or the life of the kingdom. And Qasida is again a term that we use a lot of times today. When you are praising somebody, you use the term Qasida. That is, it was for something when you were praising the courts or the kings or princes. So all the patrons, basically, when you were praising in your poems, they were Qasidas. So coming to the Masnavi form, as I was describing, when you read these poems of the time, when the way they are describing the monsoon, the rains, the clouds, you get this sense of the imagery that they're using. of the life they're coming from. Obviously, that will happen inevitably, but you can't help but wonder how their lives were full of wars and battles and not so romantic and quiet as we have today. So, if today somebody describes monsoon, that person is pretty much likely is not going to describe it in the form of battles or something. They are going to romanticize it much more. That wasn't the case with Masood Saad, for example, who described the monsoon like this. He said, "An army of clouds came to fight the army of summer. At the command of winds, the rain clouds came wielding swords to the accompaniment of the thunder of war drums. Having attacked and routed the enemy, the monsoon established its supremacy and gained power over the environment." So you see this imagery they are evoking clearly coming from group of people who have seen and witnessed a number of battles, and battles were something they were common for them, and they took great pride in those. That's obviously, this is one form of poetry where they were telling a story and they were using these metaphors. In other forms where they were uh, praising somebody, especially somebody from the court, they used different expressions which was much more direct and also evoking different emotions. But obviously that changed over time, and when we come to the time of say Amir Khusro, who was there in 13th and 13th, around 13th century, uh, you find much more romantic or emotional side, uh, or that vision, or that gaze towards the rains. For example, Khusro, in one of his ghazals, he says, "The cloud rains as I leave my beloved. What can heart do, parting from its love on a day like this?" So clearly got more romantic in those couple of centuries, and you see how these court poets started to bring the romance and associating that romance with the natural phenomenon of rains. And it's not just one way, they're not only showing the happy side of it. In fact, a lot of times they're showing the melancholy or just the sadness of it, the parting scene. For example, in this case, Khusro was talking about. So, these poets from different dynasties, the dynasties they served, and the different courts they worked in, all these Persian poets, when they were in India, they witnessed the monsoon and they incorporated its elements into their poetry. And it's kind of a consistent theme in India, right from Kalidasa or these Persian poets, or you come to today's songs on Bollywood, you won't find those kind of, in terms of numbers, also in terms of the richness, those kind of references for any other season in India as you have for the monsoon. Because this is truly the most romantic season and probably the most beautiful season in India. The summers surely cannot be romantic because there's a lot of heat, a lot of people get troubled, and then they wait for the rains, and then rains arrive. And it's such a big relief. It makes people happy. And after that, there comes the winter, and winter is not particularly interesting. People retreat, and there's not much to do. So clearly, this is one season that has been the center of attention for all kinds of artists, whether it's the painters who were depicting peacocks, the gardens, different kind of wild animals, and the greenery that was growing around, different birds that were flying, and of course the clouds and the rains, that adding colors or more richness to their paintings. So all kind of artists, they loved this season, and they still do. They still talk about it. And the Persian poets, they were no different. And I'm sure these Persian poets, they loved it, probably loved it more than the Indian poets, because when you read some of the accounts of the Persian writers of the time, some of them really criticize the weather of India. In one of the references, I saw that writer was describing the dust of Delhi, and it was horrible to them. To them, it was just like a dust bowl which was baked in heat, and they were traumatized by it. But then, of course, came the monsoons, and everybody, including them, they felt better. So that's the kind of effect it had on everybody. And clearly, the Persian poets also captured it and described it in their poetry. So that's just one chapter we have discussed. I'll discuss a few more chapters uh, in more details in the next few episodes, and I hope you'll stick by and you'll enjoy these different kinds of monsoon feelings that the people have experienced over many centuries. Thank you very much for listening. I'll catch you the next time.